Once, a bishop who chose a neutral stance, regarded as safe and somewhat inclined toward the authorities when the war broke out. But a shock occurred, powerful enough to shatter every compromise, painful enough to force the conscience to awaken. From that moment, he was no longer a protected figure, but became a target to be eliminated right at the altar. What was that shock? And what compelled a bishop who had once kept his distance to dare to stand up and demand justice, to cast off privilege, and to choose to live in poverty among the poor? He came to be called by the name that power feared and the lowly recognized, the Bishop of the Poor. That is the life of Saint Óscar Arnulfo Romero. Today, Saint Óscar Arnulfo Romero is being considered by the Church for proclamation as a doctor of the Church. Let us follow and pray together that he may soon be recognized as a master of wisdom. Before we begin, please let us know where you are from in the world in the comments section. Do not forget to like and subscribe to the channel to watch many more moving stories about the saints. A saint does not begin at the pulpit, but on the cold earthen floor, where bare feet grow accustomed to darkness, where life opens amid deprivation and silence. The story of Saint Óscar Arnulfo Romero begins in this way, far from the lights of history, very close to the ordinary rhythm of life in a poor mountainous region of Central America. In 1917, in Ciudad Barrios, a mountain town of El Salvador, Óscar Arnulfo Romero was born. That land lay apart from urban centers, with a slow pace of life, harsh nature, and people accustomed to facing scarcity as an ordinary part of daily existence. The Romero family belonged to the working class, living on the stable yet limited income of the father and the quiet diligence of the mother. From the very first moments of life, Óscar entered a world in which every meal, every coin, every passing day carried the weight of subsistence. He was the second child in a family of 8 children born to Santos Romero and Guadalupe de Jesus Galdamez. A large family meant constant sharing, learning to yield from a very early age, and a sense that one always belonged to a community larger than oneself. In that small house, the sounds of children, daily family activity, and evening prayers blended, forming a living space that was both cramped and deeply connected. Óscar grew up among his siblings, learning to observe rather than occupy center stage, learning to listen before speaking. Óscar's father worked in the postal service, operating a telegraph machine. It was a relatively stable occupation compared to the general conditions of the countryside, a job that required discipline, punctuality, and precision. This work helped the family avoid extreme hunger, but it was not enough to lift them out of hardship. Each passing month had to be carefully calculated, every expense weighed. It was within this context that Óscar early witnessed the perseverance of his father, who went faithfully to work each day to earn a modest wage, and the silent sacrifice of his mother, who kept the family standing amid material limitations. The house in which Óscar grew up was small and simple. There was no electricity, no running water. When night fell, light came from oil lamps, from the cooking fire, from the moon and stars outside the doorway. The siblings slept on the floor, close beside one another, accustomed to the cold of the earth and to sharing every bit of space. It was precisely in this environment that Óscar learned a sense of fullness that did not come from comfort, but from the presence of others. That house lacked many things the world would later consider essential, yet it was filled with shared rhythms of life, gestures of care, and family prayers carried out in silence. Óscar's childhood bore a quiet character. He spoke little, not out of timidity, but out of a habit of observing and reflecting. While many children his age sought joy in noisy play, Óscar often devoted time to books, to moments of stillness, to prayer. This inwardness did not separate him from his family or community, but helped him develop an interior life earlier than most. He learned to remain with his own thoughts, to listen to the smallest movements of life, and to ask questions about the meaning of what unfolded around him. Labor was a natural part of that childhood. In a large family, each person had a share of responsibilities. Óscar early became accustomed to small tasks, helping his parents, sharing duties with his siblings. Work was not seen as a burden, but as part of the daily rhythm of life. From this emerged in him a serious attitude toward work, a sense that human worth was bound to concrete contribution to the community. Discipline did not come from commands, but from living conditions that demanded patience and regularity. Those early years also planted in Óscar a natural connection to moral and religious life. Faith was not presented as a system of concepts, but as a living reality present in the rhythm of family life. Prayer took place within daily existence, tied to very concrete concerns, to the health of loved ones, to harvests, to work. Amid poverty, faith became a place of refuge, an interior space that helped people remain steady in the face of life's uncertainties. Óscar absorbed this atmosphere naturally, quietly, without display, yet with perseverance. It was precisely in the intersection between material deprivation and spiritual richness that the seed of vocation quietly took root. There were as yet no major decisions, no explicit declarations, but there was an increasingly clear sense that his life was bound to something beyond himself. Silence, discipline, patience, together with a deeply rooted life of prayer, gradually formed a solid foundation for later choices. The childhood of Saint Óscar Arnulfo Romero closed without the mark of dramatic events, yet it was this very ordinariness, lived amid poverty and fidelity, that prepared him for a journey that would increasingly extend beyond the boundaries of Ciudad Barrios. As he crossed the threshold into adolescence, Óscar carried within him the memory of the cold earthen floor, of oil lamps, of family labor, and of silent prayers. These things were not left behind, but became an inseparable part of who he was, quietly shaping how he would later see the world, see other people, and see his own mission in the stages that followed. Before holding the chalice, those hands had held a hammer, a chisel, and a miner's pick. The vocational path of Saint Óscar Arnulfo Romero passed through manual labor, through sweat, and through very early choices marked by sacrifice. Around the age of 12, when Óscar began to enter adolescence, his father made a decision grounded in practical reality. In early 20th century El Salvador, education opened few doors to stable employment. With a large family, limited income, and a future for each child closely tied to the ability to support oneself, his father directed his son toward learning carpentry, a trade that could provide a living through one's own hands. This decision did not stem from a denial of the value of education, but from the very concrete concern of a father facing social realities. Óscar accepted this path with his characteristic seriousness. The quiet boy began to familiarize himself with wood, tools, and the rhythm of manual labor. Carpentry demanded precision, patience, and attentiveness, qualities closely aligned with Óscar's temperament. In a short time, he quickly mastered basic skills. Óscar learned to make tables, chairs, and wooden doors, learned to measure carefully, learned how to correct mistakes when a joint was misaligned, and learned to carry a task through to completion. In the small carpentry workshop, he did not merely learn a trade, he learned respect for work and for the value of manual labor. Hours of working with wood left very real marks on his body. Calloused hands, the smell of wood clinging to his clothes, the steady sound of hammer blows. For Óscar, this was not a burden, but a part of life. Labor was not separate from human dignity. On the contrary, it helped a person stand firm amid the limits of circumstance. This experience quietly engraved within him a natural compassion for those who live by their labor, an understanding from within rather than from external observation. About 2 years later, when Óscar was around 14, a major event struck the family. His mother fell gravely ill after giving birth to her 8th child. This event shook the already fragile life of the Romero family. Illness brought medical expenses, a constant fear for the mother's survival, and mounting financial pressure. At that time, Óscar was studying at the seminary, beginning his formation for the priestly vocation. Caught between two paths, one of study and one of the family's urgent need, Óscar faced a choice earlier than his age would suggest. Óscar asked permission to take a leave of absence from the seminary for 3 months. This decision was not made lightly, for his vocation held deep meaning for him. Yet, faced with the very real suffering of his family, Óscar chose to return home, placing care for his mother above his own educational progress. Those 3 months marked a quiet turning point, where vocation was tested by responsibility and sacrifice. Together with his brothers, Óscar went to work at the Potosi gold mine. The mine was a completely different environment from the familiar carpentry workshop. The work there was arduous, dusty, and dangerous, and demanded strength and endurance. Day after day, Óscar labored under harsh conditions, becoming accustomed to the smell of earth and stone, to the sound of the pick striking the ground, to long working hours. For an adolescent, it was an experience beyond what his age might imagine, yet Óscar accepted it as a necessary part of the circumstances. The income from the gold mine was very meager. Each day, Óscar earned only a few cents. Economically speaking, the amount was very small. Yet for the Romero family at that time, it was a source of hope to purchase medicine for their gravely ill mother. Óscar sent all the money he earned home. He kept nothing for himself, saved nothing for his own future. Within those small coins lay a clear choice: placing family first, placing the life of another above his own needs. The 3 months of labor at the gold mine left a deep imprint on Óscar's inner life. His body was exhausted, his hands rougher, yet his soul was formed in a very concrete way. Óscar came to understand that vocation does not exist in an abstract void. Vocation touches human life through concrete circumstances, through illness, through poverty, through family responsibility. What was learned in the seminary needed to be tested in real life, where suffering bears a very real face. When he returned to the seminary after his leave, Óscar carried with him experiences that books could not give. He had lived within the rhythm of heavy labor, had tasted helplessness in the face of a loved one's illness, and had learned to offer his strength to others without expecting reward. These experiences became a quiet foundation for how he would later understand the priestly vocation. It was a vocation bound to human life, to sweat, to suffering, and to choices that demand genuine sacrifice. The period from 1929 to 1931 closed quietly, without major events recorded in history, yet it held decisive significance in shaping the person of Saint Óscar Arnulfo Romero. The hands that once held a hammer and a miner's pick would one day lift the Eucharist. The sweat shed in the gold mine would become a living memory, enabling him to understand the value of every poor working person. From here, the path of vocation continued to unfold, carrying with it a heart tempered amid family responsibility and the very real suffering of human life. A mountain boy enters the discipline of the seminary, and from that moment, the path of life no longer turns back along the old way. When Saint Óscar Arnulfo Romero left the small house in Ciudad Barrios to go to San Miguel in 1930, that journey bore the character of a quiet farewell. There was no solemn ceremony, no noisy send-off, only the steps of a 13-year-old boy carrying with him the memories of family, labor, and prayer as he entered a new world marked by strict discipline and a completely different rhythm of life. The minor seminary of San Miguel, run by the Claretian Fathers, was a setting that demanded rapid adaptation. For Óscar, this was the first time living away from his family for an extended period, the first time that all daily activities were organized according to a rigid schedule. The day began with prayer, followed by study, labor, and silence. This environment was both demanding and supportive, creating conditions for each seminarian to cultivate intellectual formation and interior life. For a boy accustomed to material scarcity and family discipline, The seminary was not a shock, but rather a continuation at a deeper level. The early years at San Miguel helped Óscar shape more clearly the rhythm of his vocation. He learned how to live with young men from many different regions, each bringing his own background. In that atmosphere, Óscar retained his familiar quietness. He did not seek to stand out, but his focus and sense of responsibility led superiors to recognize early on a maturity beyond his years. For Óscar, study was not a race for achievement, but a path of deepening understanding, a way of preparing himself for a future mission. This period of study was interrupted by family events and months of labor at the Potosi gold mine. When Óscar returned to the seminary after that interval, the change in him was evident. The experience of hard labor and family responsibility caused the 14-year-old boy to enter the classroom with a different outlook. Introductory lessons in philosophy and theology were no longer abstract concepts detached from reality, but became connected to the concrete faces of the poor, to memories of his mother's illness, and to sweat in the gold mine. That return marked a step of interior maturity in which learning was placed in direct relationship with lived experience. In the following years at San Miguel, Óscar completed the academic program with outstanding results. His intellectual ability stood out through concentration, discipline, and capacity for deep reflection. Superiors observed in him a rare balance between intellect and spiritual life. He was not drawn into superficial debates, but always sought to understand issues from their roots. A regular habit of prayer helped Óscar maintain interior stability amid academic pressure, and also enabled him to develop a deep personal relationship with God. In 1937, after completing his formation at the minor seminary, Óscar was sent to the National Major Seminary in San Salvador, run by the Jesuit fathers. This was a significant transition, moving him from a basic formation environment to a larger academic center that gathered the most capable seminarians from across the country. San Salvador had a rhythm of life markedly different from Ciudad Barrios in San Miguel. The city was larger, more dynamic, and also posed new challenges to the interior life of a young seminarian. At the major seminary, Óscar quickly adapted to the higher academic demands. Jesuit formation was renowned for its systematic structure, philosophical depth, and high expectations of intellectual discipline. Within only 7 months, Óscar's academic and personal growth made a strong impression on his superiors. He demonstrated an ability to grasp issues quickly, to think clearly, and to maintain a persistent spirit of self-improvement. Alongside this was a stable spiritual life that allowed him to keep balance between study and prayer. Those 7 months carried a significance far beyond their numerical length. In that brief period, Óscar showed that he was ready for a greater step in his vocational journey. Superiors recognized in him the potential for formation in an international environment, one that required independence, adaptability, and intellectual depth. It was precisely in this context that a weighty decision was made, a decision that would alter the entire trajectory of Óscar's life. After careful consideration, the bishop chose Óscar Arnulfo Romero to be sent to Rome for further formation. For a seminarian from a poor region of Central America, this was a great honor and at the same time a profound challenge. Rome was not only the academic and spiritual center of the church, but also a world entirely different in culture, language, and rhythm of life. That decision opened before Óscar a new horizon, where personal vocation was placed within the broader context of the universal church. The moment of preparing to leave El Salvador carried many intertwined emotions. Behind him were his family, his homeland, and the years of labor and study that had shaped who he was. Ahead lay a long journey across the ocean toward a Europe entering a turbulent period of history. Óscar entered this phase with his characteristic calm, carrying with him the discipline learned in the seminary, the patience formed through manual labor, and a life of prayer rooted since childhood. From the countryside of Central America, Oscar's vocational path began to open within the heart of Europe. The decision to send him to Rome was not only a recognition of personal ability, but also a sign that the formation of a mountain seminarian had crossed geographic and cultural boundaries. The road ahead would place Oscar before new trials, where war, separation, and loneliness would test his vocation in ways never before experienced. Yet the foundation built at San Miguel and San Salvador had prepared him to enter that stage with a firm interior grounding. Óscar Arnulfo Romero was no longer the boy of the cold earthen floor in Ciudad Barrios, yet he had not become a priest or shepherd of the poor. He stood at the threshold of a wider world, carrying a formation shaped by seminary discipline, rigorous study, and the very real experiences of life. From this point of transition, his story would move into a new space, where vocation would be tested amid the smoke of history and the upheavals of the world. A vocation forged amid the sound of bombs and separation, amid the ancient stone streets of Rome and the unease casting its shadow over all of Europe. When Saint Óscar Arnulfo Romero set foot in Rome in 1937, he entered a world entirely different from the mountains of El Salvador. The city bore the majesty of history, while at the same time breathing with the mounting tension of a continent moving steadily toward war. Óscar pursued theological studies at the Pontifical Gregorian University, one of the church's leading intellectual centers, and resided at the Pio Latino American College. Each day was structured according to a strict rhythm, times for prayer, study, reading, and silence. The intellectual environment demanded intense concentration, systematic thinking, and firm intellectual discipline. Classes brought together students from many countries, each carrying distinct traditions and perspectives, creating an academic space that was both rich and demanding. Academic pressure was present from the very first months. Courses in theology, philosophy, and scripture were taught at a deep level, requiring extensive reading, sustained reflection, and serious debate. For Óscar, this challenge was compounded by learning a new language, adapting to a new culture, and living far from home for the first extended period of his life. His familiar, quiet disposition helped him remain steady amid this demanding pace. He devoted much time to the library, to personal prayer, and to organizing what he had learned in order to connect it with his own lived experience. Those years were also a time when Europe was gradually sinking into an atmosphere of war. News of conflicts and the spread of violence reached Rome through newspapers and conversations in the corridors of the academic institutions. The sound of air raid sirens, evenings of enforced early darkness, and restrictions on daily life became part of student existence. Within this context, Óscar's studies took on an added dimension, as theology was reflected upon in the light of human suffering and the fragility of individual destinies. In 1941, after 4 years of diligent study, Óscar graduated with honors, cum laude. This achievement reflected his seriousness and perseverance in academic work, while also revealing his ability to connect knowledge with interior life. For Óscar, academic success represented a stage of preparation, helping him become ready for priestly ministry in a world being torn apart by violence and division. The date April 4th, 1942, marked a sacred milestone, as Óscar was ordained a priest in Rome. This moment unfolded under the shadow of war. His family in El Salvador was unable to attend because of travel restrictions and the dangers of the time. The ordination ceremony was simple, focused on the essential rites, within a small community of those who shared the same calling. For Óscar, the joy of the priesthood was mingled with a deep inner emptiness, as the familiar faces of loved ones were absent on that significant day. After the ordination, his first Mass was celebrated in a crypt of a basilica in Rome. This space, deep beneath the ground, bore the marks of the martyrdom and prayer of the earliest generations of Christians. Flickering candlelight, cold stone walls, and enveloping silence created a distinctive atmosphere of contemplation. In that moment, Óscar offered his first Eucharistic sacrifice at the heart of the universal church, carrying with him memories of family, homeland, and the poor people whose lives had left their mark on his own. The war continued to carve deep wounds into Óscar's personal life. During his time in Rome, he successively received news of the deaths of his father and one of his brothers. Letters bearing loss crossed the ocean to reach him in a foreign city. Each piece of bad news opened a new emptiness within, an emptiness he had to face in silence. Returning home to mourn became impossible due to wartime conditions. This pain was kept inward, offered up in prayer, and united with the daily Eucharistic sacrifice. Prolonged separation made homesickness more acute. Óscar continued his studies in pastoral preparation while his family faced loss without his presence. This experience helped him understand more clearly the value of presence and the cost of self-giving. The priestly vocation for him became inseparable from accepting hidden sacrifices, distances that could not be bridged, and sorrows carried within that few could see. In his final years in Rome, Óscar began to reflect more deeply on his future ministry. The war revealed a world that could easily descend into violence when human dignity was disregarded. Theological lessons on justice, human dignity, and the role of the church in society ceased to be theoretical and became concrete calls. Óscar recognized that his priestly life would have to confront harsh realities, where faith would need to be lived amid contradictions and breakdowns. Rome during the war years was both a place of intellectual formation and a school of patience and fidelity. Each day lived within an academic discipline, and the unease of the times helped Óscar cultivate the ability to remain internally grounded amid external upheaval. Silent prayers, hours of reading under dim light, and sorrowful news from home blended, forming a profound process of formation. From Rome, Óscar Arnulfo Romero carried a heavy burden as he entered the next phase of his life. This burden included solid theological knowledge, lived experience amid war, and personal wounds not yet healed. His vocation was forged amid bombs and separation, amid the joy of priesthood and the pain of loss. It was in this context that the image of a future priest gradually came into focus, a shepherd who carried within himself the memory of war and a longing to serve humanity in truth and mercy. The road back did not lead straight home, but passed through prison cells, suspicion, and illness, through days suspended between war and the fragile condition of human existence. In 1943, Saint Óscar Arnulfo Romero left Rome under circumstances not of his own choosing, carrying with him a vocation newly conferred and a future not yet fully formed. At that time, Óscar was preparing to complete his doctoral dissertation. The years of study at the Pontifical Gregorian University had laid a solid foundation for his intellectual and spiritual life. However, as the war continued to spread, conditions in Europe grew increasingly tense and unstable. In that context, an order from his superiors was issued, requiring Óscar to leave Rome immediately and return to El Salvador. This decision did not arise from personal readiness, but from the need to safeguard safety amid the upheavals of the time. His academic journey was forced to pause, giving way to a return filled with uncertainty. Óscar set out by sea, together with another priest. The transoceanic voyage carried the hope of soon setting foot again in his homeland, where family and diocese were awaiting a young priest newly ordained. The vast and unpredictable sea opened before them, reflecting Óscar's own state of mind at that moment. Behind him lay Rome, with its years of formation and loss. Ahead lay El Salvador, with memories of childhood and a ministry yet to begin. Between those 2 points stretched a journey whose outcome no one could foresee. When the ship stopped in Cuba, the journey suddenly turned in an entirely different direction. Because Óscar and his fellow priests came from Italy at a time when that country was under Mussolini's regime, they were immediately viewed with suspicion. The atmosphere of war placed all movement under watchful scrutiny. The 2 young priests were regarded as potential security risks, possibly connected to espionage. Explanations were not enough to dispel the mistrust. A decision was made swiftly and decisively, and Óscar and his companion were arrested. The period of detention lasted for 3 months in an internment camp in Cuba. Living conditions were harsh, marked by deprivation and tension. For Óscar, this was an entirely new experience, one in which human existence was reduced to fences and cold regulations. The days in the camp passed slowly, marked by exhausting waiting and constant anxiety. His priestly life, just begun, was tested through a form of confinement he had never anticipated. Óscar's physical strength gradually declined under those conditions of detention. Inadequate food, an environment lacking proper sanitation, and continuous psychological stress caused him to fall ill. The illness further weakened a body already exhausted by long travel. In those days, Óscar confronted his own fragility, realizing that a life dedicated to God was not separated from the very real limits of the human body. Each day spent in the camp became a silent prayer, offered up amid helplessness and waiting. News of the detention of the 2 young priests gradually reached religious communities. The Redemptorist Fathers intervened, using every possible connection to seek the release of Óscar and his companion. That intervention unfolded with patience and perseverance amid a complex political situation. In the end, those efforts bore fruit. Óscar was released, physically weakened, but inwardly still marked by his characteristic calm. After leaving the camp, the journey home was still not complete. Óscar continued traveling through Mexico, moving step by step closer to his homeland. Each stage of the journey carried the imprint of what he had endured, from years of study in Rome, to family losses, to months of detention and illness. That journey helped Óscar gain a deeper understanding of the meaning of freedom, of returning to community, and of reclaiming his mission. In December 1943, Óscar Arnulfo Romero finally set foot again in El Salvador. The return did not resemble a celebration, but rather the quiet presence of a young priest who had just emerged from trial. His homeland received him with familiar memories, yet the one who returned carried within himself new layers of experience. What had occurred along the way left a deep mark on how Óscar viewed the world and human life. Óscar's priestly ministry formally began within that context. He entered pastoral life with a distinctive preparation, theological learning forged in Rome, lived experience amid war and imprisonment, and a profound awareness of human vulnerability before forces beyond one's control. The months of suspicion and detention enabled Óscar to feel greater compassion for those treated unjustly, for those deprived of voice and freedom. The experience of being a prisoner on the way home did not make Óscar bitter, but helped him develop a firm inner patience. He learned how to entrust himself in situations beyond his own control, how to preserve peace amid uncertainty, and how to view each event as part of the process of vocational formation. His priestly path thus began not from ease, but from a return marked by wounds. From the end of 1943, in El Salvador, a young priest began his ministry, carrying with him the memory of the sea, of the prison camp, and of months of illness. These experiences quietly shaped the pastoral style of Saint Óscar Arnulfo Romero in the years that followed, in which his presence would become closely bound to wounded people, unjust circumstances, and pains seldom seen. No grand speeches, small structures save human lives. When he returned to El Salvador at the end of 1943, Saint Óscar Arnulfo Romero entered pastoral ministry with a quiet, steady, and persistent rhythm. His mission did not begin with attention-grabbing milestones, but with a patient presence within the community, where each day had to be built from very concrete tasks. San Miguel became the place of his long-term commitment. For nearly 20 years, Father Romero served this parish as a disciplined, devoted priest with notable organizational ability. He paid close attention to the order of parish life, liturgical schedules, catechetical formation, and coordination among parish associations. Everything was carefully arranged, aimed at helping the community function stably amid social changes that were quietly intensifying. His style was calm and methodical, creating a sense of trust among the faithful. During those years, Father Romero quickly recognized that the spiritual life of the community was closely tied to very real-life issues. Alcohol addiction was a reality that harmed many families. Rather than merely offering admonitions from the pulpit, he established Alcoholics Anonymous groups, creating spaces where those struggling with addiction could meet, share, and support one another. This initiative opened a practical approach that helped people gradually recover their dignity through patient accompaniment. Alongside this were simple yet effective charitable initiatives. Father Romero persuaded cafe owners in the area to open their doors to the poor, allowing them to eat and rest. This action broke down familiar social boundaries, bringing those pushed to the margins back into the shared space of the community. For Father Romero, charity did not stop at distribution, but aimed to create conditions for the poor to be present within everyday life. One of the distinctive marks of this period is the story of an old radio transmitter. Father Romero realized that many poor people, especially in remote areas, had difficulty attending the liturgy regularly. From this concern arose the idea of using radio waves to connect the community. Parishioners were invited to contribute money, small amounts at a time, to purchase a second-hand transmitter. This collective effort reflected a spirit of communion, in which each person joined hands for a goal that transcended individual interest. From that old transmitter, the first Catholic radio station in San Miguel was born. Through radio waves, the Mass, homilies, and pastoral announcements were broadcast, reaching poor families, the sick, and those limited by geographic distance. The radio station became a connecting bridge, bringing the life of faith to people often forgotten. For many, Father Romero's voice on the radio brought a sense of closeness, as if the shepherd were present in their own homes. Father Romero's pastoral conviction was clearly expressed during this period. He believed that if the poor could not come to church, the Word of God needed to be brought directly to their ears. This conviction shaped how he organized pastoral work, emphasizing accessibility and accompaniment. Radio became a means of service, not for display, but to meet a very concrete need of the community. The years in San Miguel were also a time when Father Romero cultivated patience. The results of initiatives did not come immediately. Support groups needed time to function stably, and the radio station faced many technical and financial difficulties. Father Romero chose to move forward step by step, adjusting when necessary and maintaining a steady work rhythm. It was precisely this perseverance that created a solid foundation for pastoral life. In his personal life, Father Romero continued to maintain discipline in prayer and study. He devoted time to reading, reflection, and careful preparation of homilies. A simple lifestyle helped him remain focused on his mission. His closeness to parishioners, especially the poor, enabled him to better understand what was happening in society. Through everyday stories and family visits, Father Romero gradually accumulated a rich store of pastoral experience. This nearly 20-year period shaped the image of a priest quietly building. Small structures were formed, from social support groups to the local radio station, helping sustain the community through challenging years. Father Romero did not seek attention, yet his work left a lasting imprint on parish life. San Miguel became a testing ground for a pastoral approach based on organization, accompaniment, and creative accessibility. It was precisely in this quietness that a shepherd was prepared for greater challenges. Organizational experience helped Father Romero understand how a community functions. Direct contact with the poor through charitable initiatives enabled him to sense deeply the injustices quietly simmering beneath the surface. Radio helped him grasp the power of the pastoral voice when placed in the right context and at the right moment. All these elements converged, forming a firm interior foundation. By the end of the 1970s, as El Salvador's social context began to undergo intense upheaval, Father Romero carried with him the baggage of nearly 20 years of quiet service. It was a baggage of discipline, closeness to the poor, organizational ability, and a pastoral conviction forged over time. The years in San Miguel did not produce loud echoes on the national stage, but it was precisely there that the priest of the radio was formed, ready to step into new turns of ministry, where his voice would need to be raised more forcefully amid the upheavals of history. A death brought an end to silence. Before 1977, St. Óscar Arnulfo Romero was regarded as a well-ordered, cautious bishop, faithful to ecclesial order and discipline. His manner reflected years of rigorous formation, in which stability was considered a necessary condition for safeguarding pastoral life. Within the unstable social context of El Salvador, this way of being led many to see him as a safe point of reference, and also led the authorities to believe that this bishop would keep his distance from the simmering conflicts. Romero entered 1977 with the disposition of a shepherd who wished to preserve unity and order. He chose measured words, avoided statements that might cause upheaval, and believed that the church's steady presence could help society gradually settle. His vesture was neat, his manner formal, his decisions carefully weighed. Many within the ruling circles saw in Romero an easy partner for dialogue, a bishop who would not disrupt a fragile political landscape. The day 12 March 1977 cut through that state with an unavoidable shock. Jesuit priest Rutilio Grande, a close friend and spiritual companion of Romero, was assassinated while serving poor farmers. The tragic news spread quickly, carrying shock and outrage throughout the community. For Romero, this was a deeply personal event. For Grande was not a distant name, but someone who shared with him pastoral concerns and conversations about the church's mission among the poor. When Romero stood before the body of Rutilio Grande, the long-held interior silence was shattered. The blood of his friend lay there, real and concrete, posing a question that could not be avoided. Careful reflections and moderate choices suddenly appeared fragile in the face of the death of a priest who had given his life to the poor. That moment awakened in Romero a new awareness of pastoral responsibility, in which neutrality became a burden on conscience. The interior shock unfolded in silence, but its consequences were clearly visible in the decisions that followed. Romero realized that the voice of the church could not remain outside when violence was taking the lives of pastors and faithful alike. The death of Grande was no longer an isolated event, but a sign that violence had reached the very core of ecclesial life. From that moment, Romero understood that remaining silent meant allowing evil to continue to spread. A bold decision was made swiftly. Romero canceled all Sunday masses throughout the archdiocese, an unprecedented act in that context. In their place, he announced that a single mass would be celebrated at the Metropolitan Cathedral of San Salvador to commemorate Father Rutilio Grande and to stand in solidarity with the victims of violence. This decision carried great symbolic weight because it placed the entire archdiocese within a single liturgical act, turning the Mass into a public cry of conscience. That single Mass became a point of convergence for grief and hope. The cathedral was filled, faces bearing fear, anger, and a longing to be heard. In that atmosphere, Romero did not seek to soothe with vague words. His presence, standing at the altar, declared that the church chose communion with those who were suffering. The Mass became a proclamation that the death of a priest could not be minimized or forgotten. The reaction from the government was swift and harsh. The decision to cancel Sunday Masses was viewed as a challenge to public order. Political pressure intensified, and warnings were sent to the archdiocese. At the same time, some other bishops expressed reservations, fearing that such an action could deepen tensions and cause division. Romero faced opposition from multiple sides, Yet the decision flowed from an interior conviction that could not be withdrawn. The days that followed marked a clear change in Romero. His orderly demeanor remained, but the focus had shifted. He began to look at social reality with different eyes, paying attention to voices that had been ignored, to families who had lost loved ones to violence. Meetings with farmers, with poor parishioners, and with relatives of victims became more frequent. Former caution gave way to a mode of presence that was closer and more committed. The death of Rutilio Grande opened a new path for Romero. That path led him out of the safe position of a widely accepted bishop and into the role of a prophetic voice. From this point on, every homily and every pastoral decision carried clear social consequences. Romero understood that he had entered a space where words could save lives, but could also place his own life in danger. This transformation did not occur impulsively. It was the result of an interior process brought to a decisive point by the death of a close friend. Romero did not abandon discipline or prayer. On the contrary, these elements became the resources that enabled him to stand firm under pressure. It was precisely the combination of spiritual depth and social alertness that generated new strength in his ministry. The year 1977 thus became a pivotal milestone. From this point onward, Romero no longer stood on the margins of social events. He stepped into the center of the dialogue on justice and human dignity. The support once offered by the authorities gradually dissolved, replaced by suspicion and confrontation. Yet for Romero, the path had already been chosen from the moment he stood before the body of Rutilio Grande. That death awakened the conscience of a shepherd and altered the course of a life. From a conservative and cautious bishop, Romero became the voice of those who had been silenced. The silence had ended, and in its place began a journey of commitment whose ultimate consequences would resonate far beyond the borders of El Salvador. They killed a human being, but they could not kill a voice. From 1977, the life of Saint Óscar Arnulfo Romero entered a phase in which every choice carried clear consequences. A phase in which the pastoral voice no longer resonated only within parish boundaries, but reached the whole of Salvadoran society, torn apart by violence. His personal life bore an increasingly visible mark of poverty. Saint Óscar Romero stripped away every form of luxury associated with the office of Archbishop. He wore a simple cassock, walked in old shoes worn thin by time. His meals were shared with farmers, sitting on the ground, eating from the same modest pot of rice. His residence was not a palace, but a small room within the grounds of the Divina Providencia Hospital, where terminal cancer patients were cared for. Among people facing death each day, the Archbishop found a space consonant with his vocation, where presence itself became a consolation more powerful than any speech. In a context of strict press censorship, the Archdiocesan radio station became the primary means through which truth could be spoken. Every Sunday after the homily, Saint Óscar Romero devoted time to reading the names of those who had disappeared, been kidnapped, or been killed during the week. Each name was read slowly and clearly, carrying the story of an entire family. In rural areas, people gathered around small radios, listening in silence. That voice assured them that their suffering was not forgotten. For this reason, the radio station repeatedly became a target of attack, bombed in attempts to silence the pastoral voice. Each time, efforts to resume broadcasting were made, as an affirmation that truth must be spoken despite danger. Confrontation with power became increasingly public. Saint Óscar Romero refused to participate in government ceremonies of a political nature, choosing to stand apart from forms that legitimized violence. In 1980, fully aware that military aid from the United States was being used to repress the poor in El Salvador, he wrote a personal letter to President Jimmy Carter. In the letter, he urgently requested an end to military assistance because, in his view, such support only increased the suffering of civilians. This action placed him in direct opposition to right-wing forces, both within the country and abroad. and made the threat to his life more tangible than ever. On 23 March 1980, during the Sunday homily, St. Óscar Romero issued a call that sent shockwaves. He addressed soldiers and police officers directly, those carrying out orders of repression, and called on them to lay down their weapons. The appeal rang out like a command of conscience, delivered with urgency and clarity. In the political context of the time, these words were understood as a direct challenge to the state's machinery of violence. For many, this was the moment they realized that the Archbishop's fate had been sealed. On the evening of 24 March 1980, St. Óscar Romero was celebrating Mass in the chapel of the Divina Providencia Hospital. In that small space among the sick and a familiar community, he preached on sacrifice and self-giving. Immediately after the homily, as he stood before the altar, a bullet pierced his chest. St. Óscar Romero collapsed at the foot of the cross, his blood mingling with the wine on the altar. Witnesses later recounted that the chalice remained standing, an image passed on as a spiritual sign of total self-offering. Not long before, St. Óscar Romero had said, "If they kill me, I will rise again in the hearts of the people." Those words resounded like a prophecy. His death did not silence his voice. It caused it to travel farther, beyond the borders of El Salvador. The image of an archbishop assassinated at the altar became a symbol of a church standing with the poor, willing to pay the price to defend truth and human dignity. In the years that followed, the name of St. Óscar Romero continued to be invoked in human rights movements and in the faith lives of millions. He came to be recognized as a witness to the gospel in a century marked by violence. In 2015, the church proclaimed him blessed, affirming that his death was martyrdom for the faith. 3 years later, in 2018, St. Óscar Romero was canonized, presented before the entire people of God as a model of holiness with universal significance. His canonization was linked to a miracle recognized by the Church, involving Cecilia Flores, a Salvadoran woman who suffered severe postpartum complications, HELLP syndrome. In critical condition, when doctors had lost hope, her family prayed to St. Óscar Romero. Her complete recovery, medically inexplicable, became the sign confirming the intercession of the martyr. Since 2018, the legacy of St. Óscar Romero has continued to spread globally. 24th March, the day of his assassination, was chosen by the United Nations as the International Day for the right to the truth concerning gross human rights violations and for the dignity of victims. His name is cited in international forums and faith communities as a symbol of fidelity to the gospel amid injustice. The voice of St. Óscar Romero, raised from a modest radio station and silenced by gunfire, continues to echo. That voice reminds us that faith is bound to truth, that human dignity cannot be sacrificed to power, and that the death of a witness can become a seed of life for many generations. God our Father, rich in mercy, before the face of St. Óscar Arnulfo Romero, we raise to you the prayer of the lowly, of those who carry within themselves fear, injustice, and a longing to live in truth. Grant that the Church may know how to listen to the cry of the poor, may have the courage to speak the truth amid silence and compromise, may choose to stand on the side of life, even when that path leads to the cross. Through the intercession of St. Óscar Romero, grant us hearts sensitive to the suffering of our brothers and sisters, ears that do not close to the cries of those who are forgotten, and feet ready to step out of comfort zones to remain with those who are trampled upon. Grant that those who hold power may experience a conversion of conscience, respect human dignity, and seek peace not through violence, but through justice and truth. Father, as the grain of wheat that dies to bear much fruit, grant that the martyrdom of St. Óscar Romero may continue to bear fruit in our lives today, so that amid a world full of darkness, we may become bearers of the light of the gospel. We ask this through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. I bless all of you who have clicked like on this video. May God, through the intercession of the saints, grant you peace, good health, and an abundance of blessings in your lives. Return to the tabernacle. Return to the light of the Eucharistic body of Christ. Return to the moment of silent companionship with the one who waits for us in the sacrament of love. And if, in what I have shared today, you find even just one or two sentences that touch your heart and help you draw closer to God, then I am content.